Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 21 of our discussion of Inferno. As we continue tonight, we're going to get pretty close to the very end of the Malebolgia, which is kind of exciting. That's certainly progress as we get down towards the ninth circle, which is where we've been headed all along. Yeah, so my background here is, well, okay, like honestly, very few of the backgrounds in Hell have been extremely appealing. I'm surrounded by like naked bodies here this evening. Bodies are kind of the theme. Of course, they've been a running theme throughout Inferno, bodies in various stages of the lack of bodily integrity are kind of the theme of the 9th and 10th pouches there. Stephen is wondering which we'll finish discussing first, the Council of Elrond or Hell. Oh, no question. No question. We'll come to the end of Hell before we come to the end of the Council of Elrond. I can pretty much promise you that by a good bit, I suspect. I'll be surprised, Stephen, if we're not halfway through our next book before we get to the end of the Council of Elrond and exploring the Lord of the Rings. Anyway, okay. So just before we start, just real quick, just a brief announcement. I mentioned last week that Mythmoot is going to be a hybrid event this year. It's going to be both in person and also a fully digital interactive experience. That's going to be a lot of fun. We still have not yet posted the registration links for that, so if you haven't seen those, it's not just you. We're finalizing some things. We want to make sure to get everything lined up and all, and then those will be open. I hope those will be open next week as we continue to work on those. But stay tuned for registration links for both upgrades, if you can, if you've already signed up for the digital experience but would like to come in person instead, and of course links for people to sign up that way from scratch. So that will be coming soon. All right. So I said it the last time that we would begin by asking the question, because I still don't know. What's the sin? The folks on fire that we were talking about last week? What are your ideas about why the people who are wreathed in flame, the people with the tongues of flame up there at the tip of the, whose the tips of whose flames are like tongues. Remember that whole like translation thing, the whole Sicilian Bull episode there in Canto 27, and then obviously Ulysses, right, being the big one there. So what do we think? What do we think? Now, one thing that I want to remind folks of, because this was a trend we were noticing, especially at the very beginning of the Malebolgia, as we were beginning to think about fraud. And we've kind of haven't talked about it as much lately, but I don't think there's any evidence that it's any less true. I think the pattern has continued. We just haven't been talking about it as much. The pattern that I'm referring to is the fact that the fraud, one of the major trends among all of the different kinds of fraud that we were seeing in the first like 4 or 5 pouches, was that there was actual like gain involved, right? It was about an often financial gain. So fraud being, so not just like I'm deceiving somebody, for like some random, like specifically there was usually money changing hands. These were ways, not necessarily just thievery, but either facilitating or directly involved in getting money out of folks. And that was an interesting thing, and I think it remains true. I think it remains true. I don't bring that in because I'm saying like we need to take that as a rule and apply that as a rule. I mean, if it doesn't continue to fit, it doesn't continue to fit. But yeah. Interesting. Okay, so Bruce is suggesting that it's definitely counseling people to commit fraud themselves. Okay, so it's not directly defrauding someone else, Bruce, is your argument, but that it is urging or convincing other people to commit fraud. Ulysses, of course, is one of the biggest. Now, we saw the second guy, the Italian dude, right? The guy who is so relieved that fortunately nobody would be able to bring this tale back to the surface. That guy was a counselor, right? And he was the one who was compelled by the Pope, right? Who had lived a bad life and had become a friar in order to save his soul, right? So he was living his latter years in repentance for his misspent life. But then, like, he was like, drawn out of retirement by the Pope, who had promised to absolve him of his sins in advance, but that didn't pan out. And yeah. Now, it's interesting because on the one hand, the fraud, if there was anyone who was defrauded in that last incident, it would seem to be, or at least the sinner himself, through the medium of the tongue of flame, right? Like the Sicilian bull. He seemed to suggest or imply that he was the victim there, right? The Pope totally defrauded him. The Pope was all like, I absolve you in advance. So he was like, so I did it because, like, I was absolved in advance. Like, what could happen? And I was kind of making fun of him throughout at how little responsibility he was taking for his choices and his own actions. But nevertheless, again, he did not defraud the Pope in that he gave him what he asked for, right? I mean, he asked for sound advice and he gave him sound advice. Now, sound advice to achieve a bad end, and perhaps, again, Bruce, as you were suggesting, conspiring at fraud there, right? As Bruce is saying, his counsel to the Pope was promise much, but not deliver. So yes, like somebody was being swindled there. Right? It wasn't the Pope. That is, the Italian dude wasn't, whose name I've forgotten, was not doing the swindling, right? But he was advising on the swindling. And the same could be said of Ulysses. That Ulysses also, the big fraud, right, is the Trojan horse, right? The Trojan horse as act of fraud, which is the way that it was described. Like that was clear that fraud was being associated, or that the element of fraud, that element of deception, the fraudulent gift, as the clear act of fraud there. Now there was also the business about the Palladium, right? The theft of the Palladium, and in particular, that one weighs really strongly with me because of the Diomedes connection, right? Because of the way that Ulysses and Diomedes are connected there in death, and the sort of joint exploit that they took part in was the theft of the Palladium. So and it's one of the few things, it's one of the few elements for which, in which Ulysses was directly involved. I mean, he was a famous counselor, right? I mean, he was, that's why he was recruited by the Greeks. I mean, yes, he's a great warrior too, but primarily he's the wily counselor. And so Ulysses thought up a lot of plans, but was rarely the one in the Greek army who was executing them, except for the theft of the Palladium. But yeah, Tony, sinful counselors, yes, but so I think it is an interesting theory, Bruce, and it's better than anything I had, theory-wise, because the thing that I would emphasize, Bruce, which I'm sure you would too, is the emphasis in the case of both of them on talk, right, on speech. The way that the tongues of flame themselves emphasize the speech, the way that we get this like displaced speech from, especially from the Italian counselor, right? That seems, it seems crucial, right? It seems, and not only just that it was the instrument of torture, right? That it was the instrument of, you know, how they were being punished, but that it was also the vicarious voice, the way that it was like the mediator, the flame was the mediator between speaker and hearer, was really drawing attention to words, and the like the disconnect between the people and their words, right? Especially, again, especially with the Italian counselor and all that stuff. And you're right, Arthur, they were also, in fact, liars whose pants were verily on fire. Perfectly true. Yeah, and so, but I'm not sure, Arthur, that I'd say that they were exactly seducing people into sin, because again, like the Pope, right? I mean, come on, right? Like when the Pope comes to this counselor, if anybody's doing the seducing, I mean, again, like we get this guy's really partial and lame, you know, sort of self-exculpating version of the story, which was pretty transparent there from the beginning. That is the transparency of his trying to shovel off blame onto the Pope and to make himself out to be innocent. But nevertheless, it's certainly clear that it wasn't him, you know, leading the Pope into temptation there at that point. So yeah, I like the idea. I like the idea of the counselors. It's not that I think that they are necessarily sinning against the people they're counseling. Again, that's the thing I've always had a hard time with. Like, you know, fraudulent counselors is how this is almost always labeled, right? People always casually say, "Oh, it's the circle that, you know, it's the pouch of the fraudulent counselors," and that never seemed to me right. Not quite right. Anyway, I mean, it's close. That the giving of counsel should be the connecting element between Ulysses and the other dude. Sure, like that makes a lot of sense, right? But again, it's not their counsel that was fraudulent. So what I like about it is the idea that basically it's people who are, it's emphasizing their responsibility, the power of their words, right? They counseled to the fraud. They didn't commit the fraud themselves, right? They conspired to commit fraud. They advised people to, you know, fraud was committed on their say so, right, on their advice, but that doesn't make them not guilty. That doesn't mean that they're innocent of fraud, right, or even that they're going to end up in some different place, right? They end up here instead. Exactly, Tony. They're enablers. That's exactly right. Yeah, evil counselors rather than fraudulent counselors. Yes, I mean, I think evil counselors is more accurate, though not very specific, though. Yes, professional fraud advisors for hire. Exactly. Need some fraud perpetrated? Come to us. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. Yeah. Now, the last thing that I would, yeah, oh, Serena, that's really good. It's a really good point. Serena says, Guido, thank you. I keep forgetting the Italian dude's name. I can stop calling him Italian dude. Serena was pointing out that the emphasis on words, she says, makes a little more sense out of the whole strange bit about Virgil saying goodbye to Ulysses off stage and then Guido quoting what he said, right? So we still get Virgil's words to Ulysses, but not directly, right? And as she says, it's about, you know, speech, more speech, no speech, reported speech, right? Again, that kind of distancing between the speaker and the words, right? But of course, it's Virgil there, right? So we get Virgil's words at a distance, which is interesting, right? In fact, we're getting Virgil's words at the greatest distance because Guido, who quotes Virgil, his words, including the quote of Virgil, are distanced from him, right, and mediated through the flame. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, now Devora says, if they advised fraud, where are the people who took their advice? Have we been told that? Well, I mean, we know where the Pope is, or we see where he's going. And that's back with the Simonists, right? Because that one kind of trumps this one, as far as the significance of the crime is concerned. But anyway, yeah. We saw, sorry, what I'm thinking about right now is I'm scanning back in my mind and trying to remember other Trojan War heroes, other Greeks specifically. That is, other folks who perpetrated the fraud, Devora, of the Trojan horse. And the only one I can remember offhand is Achilles. He was with the lustful, but he wasn't involved with the Trojan horse anyway. He was already dead by then. So that that wouldn't be relevant, but yeah. Right. Marilyn is saying sinful use of words. Yeah, and what's interesting to me, Marilyn? What's interesting to me is that I would have expected there to have been more emphasis on words in the circle of fraud, right? But there's not been so much. It's not that it's never come up, right? Some of them have been guilty of fraud. They've all been guilty of fraud. Some of them have been guilty of fraud by words, but not all that many. It's not, like, we've seen things like, pimping and seducing and divination and taking bribes and stuff like that, simony, right? But we don't have that many folks. We have the flatterers, right? They were big word people, but it's been a minority, I think, which is interesting to me, Marilyn. And again, it gives an interesting weight, I think, to your observation there. Again, others have used fraudulent words, but again, the thing that makes these guys interesting is that their words themselves are not fraudulent. Again, take the flatterers, right? Flatterers are using words, but they're committing their fraud through their words, right? The flattery that they utter is itself fraudulent, right? It is in fact the fraudulent act. Whereas these counselors, neither one of them, their words were not fraudulent. They were about fraud, right? They were true, accurate, savvy, cunning words, which maintained faithfulness with they maintained their integrity with the person who hired them, right? Again, they were doing their job. They were not defrauding the people they were counseling. They were counseling people how to defraud people, right? So it's sort of indirect by the medium of words, at a distance in that way. Yeah. The hypocrites, Bruce. Yes, I think so. Though the hypocrisy of the hypocrites would clearly also extend beyond mere words, right? Like other forms of outward show by which one was committing hypocrisy, and not only words. But yeah, words certainly would be involved, and words would be involved, in many of the others, like the seducers presumably used words too. But yeah. Weird. Sorry, people are saying I'm having mic issues, which is strange. My mic should not be having issues, and I have no explanation for my mic having issues. Oh dear. Hope my mic isn't dying. That would be disquieting. So let me know if it continues. I don't know what to do if it does continue, to be perfectly frank, but I guess I could try to switch to another mic source. Anyway, yeah, let me know. Okay. Yeah. And Alistair, in YouTube, as you point out, the being like sort of planting the seed of a fraudulent idea that others carry out in some ways carries more weight than the individual act of fraud. And I agree. I mean, I would, point out in support of that, of course, those guys were in the, what, 8th pouch, right? So if we do conclude that the further we get towards the middle, the worse things get, then yeah, like they're worse than the flat earthers, for instance, with whom we were just just speaking. So okay. Yeah. But you're right, Stephen. That is clearly the point. As counselors, they're responsible for their counsel. Advising others to sin is itself sinful. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that I think is a good lesson. Now, okay, one last question that I can't forbear to answer. It's a dangerous question because I have no idea the answer myself, but then again, I'm not usually afraid of those questions, especially not in this discussion. So why do we get the long story about Ulysses' trip by sea, going out beyond the Pillars of Hercules, going down with the ship when he comes to the isle with the high mountain, which is going to turn out to be Mount Purgatory, but looks a lot like Taniquetil if you squint. What do we make of that? Now, I'm not saying that I necessarily think that Ulysses, that incident has to be like the sin for which Ulysses is down there. It seems to me entirely possible, at least possible, if not definite, but at least possible, that he, we get at the beginning what his sin was, right? What he did to, get down there, which was, because we're told about the Trojan horse and the, both the Trojan horse and the Palladium are mentioned very early on. So we get those at the beginning, and then we just get this other story. Because remember, Virgil asks him not what he did to get down into hell, but how he died specifically. Please, Virgil elicits that story. Tell us the story of how you died. And Ulysses is like, oh, okay, sure, I'll tell you the story of how I died, which is interesting because it's also like the unpublished sequel to the Odyssey, right? Which Virgil never wrote. So that's kind of interesting in that way. So right, Bruce, maybe he's doing research for his Virgil, or he's doing research for the sequel. I don't know, but yeah, I mean, Serena, I agree. I mean, the kind of relevance that it has about relevance that it has to Dante and the potential hubris of his art in his journey. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to avoid that, I think. There's much in what Ulysses does, which is kind of Dantean, right? Going beyond mortal limits, transgressing. I mean, he literally is going to end up in the place which is next on Dante's itinerary, right? Namely Mount Purgatory, right? That place which Ulysses attempted to go in transgression, right? Out of hubris and arrogance. Dante is, been called and approved to go to. So there is both, contrast, but also some caution and similarity there. Yes, Sarah says, I assume it isn't just because Dante wanted to add his 2 cents to the Homeric epics, right? Well, which remember, he doesn't know themselves, but do Do I think it's impossible that he just wanted to add his 2 cents, to this sort of epic tradition around Ulysses? No, I don't think that's impossible at all. I mean, in fact, Sarah, I mean, if we think back, right, we just had the, remember the take that, Lucan, right? Take that, Ovid, poetic one-upsmanship thing back with the snakes. Is he one-upping Homer here? Does he think he's one-upping Homer? I mean, again, he's not read Homer, and he knows he's not read Homer, but he does also know that Homer wrote the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus, which, of course, and the whole arc of that poem is about going home. It's about the return to the homeland, and to not only give sort of a sequel to that, but to undo it, essentially, right? By saying, well, having arrived home, Odysseus says, yo, forget it. This is lame, right? Hey, Penelope, thanks for waiting. Hey, Telemachus, right? Good to see my son finally, but I'm out of here. Right? Forget it. This is so boring. I'm going to the end of the earth. I get the way that it kind of like unmakes the end of the Odyssey. Now, again, he doesn't know the Odyssey. He's not really connecting to that work directly, but indirectly. And again, his sympathies are pretty strongly Virgilian, I think, rather than Homeric. So that Dante would in some sense set himself to kind of one up Homer, like sort of indirectly. I mean, that would make sense. Of course, Serena, that doesn't do much for the whole caution against hubris angle, right? That would make you kind of wonder if he was, paying attention. Yeah. Now, Stephen is thinking about sort of the spiritual angle on it, which I think is a really important one, Stephen, because of course, Stephen is remembering the whole tongues of flame connection, right? Which connects both, gives this whole Pentecost connection, right, to that whole pouch, and thinking about the displacement of words and the giving of counsel as well, right? The way that the Holy Spirit descends upon the apostles and gives them words, right? So that there's also, in its way, Pentecost. The story of Pentecost itself also is about a certain kind of distance between words and between like the words and the words and the speakers, right? The speakers at Pentecost are saying words that they don't understand. They don't know what they are saying because they don't speak the languages in which they are speaking. Many of their hearers do, but they don't speak the language, so that there's a distance between the speaker and the words in the case of Pentecost. Now it's different, right? It's sort of twisted and it's turned into torment. Again, remember the Sicilian bull as we discussed that. But anyway, so Stephen was talking about, we also get, of course, Ulysses drawing near to salvation the wrong way, right? Like he's trying to invade the undying lands and seize eternal life for himself or something like that. Who would do that, right? That's crazy. And like, wouldn't you think like the ground would open up under somebody who did something like that? And sure enough, the sea does open up and he's dropped down into the abyss, like you would expect would happen, right? Yeah. That's, yeah, that's strange. So yes, so I'm trying to kind of correlate the two, or the three, the many different points that we're sort of making here. Stephen, that point does kind of come back around to the, it does kind of come back around to the journey And what am I trying to say? Dante's hubris is what I'm coming back around to, right? That Dante, his journey is licensed, right? And it's not just the tour of the afterlife that he's being given. Remember that on the personal and individual level, this is also Dante's own journey to salvation. In the end, the poem will end, spoiler, the poem will end with Dante seeing God face to face. That is the whole poem, right? At the end of Paradiso, that's what's going to happen. So there is this salvation arc for Dante's character throughout this whole poem as well. So this is one of the things that I'm kind of reminded of when we think about the Dante's character, the kind of sketchy things. I'm thinking back in particular to the number, the several recent, and they seem to be almost increasing, really, references to fame, right? Like fame in the world is what matters. And Dante, he's now going around, like, there were a couple people who said, you who are in the world, you can tell me this, or, you know, occasionally this would be kind of held out as like, I shall return to the overworld and I shall tell everybody the truth about you. Dante's throwing around that promise like candy down here in the Malebolgia. And even when he doesn't, it's being emphasized, ironically, as it was with Guido in the previous canto. Yeah. So it's just an interesting thing to remember, right? Dante might be screwed up, right? Dante might be screwing up, right? I mean, we may be seeing him sin. And I think that's one of the things that might well be, that he might be dramatizing, essentially. His own, because remember, he has a great deal of spiritual progress himself yet to make. He's not even gotten to the point that Ulysses almost got to, right? Okay, but I have an idea. Let's move on to our first slide. Okay, next circle. Who, even with untrammeled words and many attempts at telling, could ever recount in full the blood and wounds that now I saw? Each tongue that tried would certainly fall short, because the shallowness of both our speech and intellect cannot contain so much. Okay, so hang on a second here. Let's start with that part. Words, again, right? Speech, except now it's the inadequacy of speech. And he talks about, on the one hand, this is a testimony to the quantity of gore and wounds that he is going to be, describing, and that he saw, right? If you took many attempts at telling and your words were totally untrammeled, right? You could go on and on as long as you wanted. Who, even under those circumstances, could recount in full the blood and wounds that now I saw? But I'm particularly interested by each tongue that tried would certainly fall short, because the shallowness of both our speech and intellect cannot contain so much. So each tongue that tried, this is like, what, a couple dozen lines after that description of the tongue of flame on Guido's fire, right? So I have sort of suspicion here, right? That Dante is, to see Dante now talking about the shallowness of our speech and intellect, right? Speech and intellect. Tarlonio, I agree. This is one of the not to be read while eating circles. Yes, this one as this one gets a little bit gruesome. But you can't say he doesn't warn you. You can't say he doesn't warn you. Okay. Sorry, I'm pausing for a second because I can't help but think to kind of correlating the shallowness of speech and intellect here, right? The failure of tongues because of the shallowness of speech and intellect, and the distance, the separation of speech from intellect in the previous canto. I'm not quite sure what to do with that. Anyway, okay, how about move on? Were you to reassemble all the men who once within Apulia's fateful land had mourned their blood shed at the Trojans' hands, as well as those who fell in the long war where massive mounds of rings were battle spoils, even as Livy writes, who does not err. And then he goes on to talk about a bunch of other like descriptions of wars. And then were one to show his limb pierced through and show his limb pierced through and one his limb hacked off, that would not match the hideousness of the ninth abyss. I didn't need to quote all of the, I wasn't necessarily interested in looking at all of the catalogs of different wars and warring cities that he was talking about. But I did want to get to the end of the sentence, right? Which is, if we reassembled all of the mutilated corpses from all of the war poetry, you know, that both classical and modern, right? It would not match the hideousness of the ninth abyss, right? There are more mutilated corpses here than in all of those things put together. Arthur is suspecting perhaps the people are down here because of they're guilty of the sin of believing that Livy does not err. Probably not. Yeah. Yes, the ineffability of violence, Serena. Exactly. Yeah, Serena, I would say both that his emphasis is on the inadequacy of words and the overwhelming horror of the violence, but I agree with you. It may well be the second, right? But see, against that sentence, right? That sentence doesn't say anything about the magnitude of the subject. It only speaks of the inadequacy of the medium, right? The intellect and speech. But anyway, okay, so the immediate context that we're given at the beginning is military, right? It's martial, and it's not only military, because it's not only wars that he is pointing to. It's literary accounts of wars that he's alluding to, which is particularly interesting. In other words, again, one of the things that he's doing is kind of putting what he's doing here in the context of, you know, is this what, like, Livy eat your heart out, right? Like, so, you know, he was already one-upping Ovid and maybe Homer, and now he's one-upping Livy also, right? Not to mention all the men who once within Apulia's fateful land had mourned their blood shed at the Trojans' hands. That would be Virgil, right? All of these other poets who have depicted all of these things. He's all of everything they described put together would not match what he is about to describe and evoke, right? Gore and mutilation in the context of battles, in the context of literary descriptions of battles. Okay, all right. No barrel, even though it's lost a hoop or end piece, ever gapes as one whom I saw ripped right from his chin to where we fart. His bowels hung between his legs. One saw his vitals and the miserable sack that makes of what we swallow excrement. While I was all intent on watching him, he looked at me, and with his hands he spread his chest and said, "See how I split myself. See now how maimed Mohammed is. And he who walks and weeps before me is Ali, whose face is opened wide from chin to forelock. And all the others here whom you can see were, when alive, the sowers of dissension and scandal, and for this they now are split. Okay. So, yeah, Gerald, I agree. Gerald says, Homer does a pretty good job of describing gruesomeness. Too bad Dante didn't have Homer to compare depictions with. You know, Gerald, I actually, it's a really good point. Though I would say, Gerald, Virgil follows Homer in that. The very graphic description of what happens to people's bodies on the battlefield. I was going to cite some examples, but I suspect this canto is probably bad enough for some of you. So it's not like he does not have that kind of genre to work with, right? But again, that's one of the reasons, Gerald, why I emphasize the literary depiction of battles angle here, because that does seem to me to be one of the, like, again, he is kind of taking aim at classical precedents, right? And taking his place among them. Okay, now, schismatics, absolutely. Muhammad is here. Muhammad is here because he is a sower of dissension, he says, right? Sowers of dissension and scandal, and for this they now are split. Yeah. Okay. One thing that's interesting here is that the connection between the punishment and the sin is a lot clearer than we've seen in some time, right? In fact, it's hard to remember any clearer than this since, well, arguably the diviners, but the flatterers for sure. But yes, like those who caused schisms, their bodies are split, right? That's okay. All right, I'm tracking there. How is this fraud? My little question. Malice, okay, bigger topic, but how's it fraud exactly? And does it fit with like the money stuff we were seeing? It's interesting. Or how might that help us to understand this? In particular, I always find this very interesting because this is an unusual way to talk about Muhammad in the Middle Ages. I mean, Muhammad is, of course, roundly condemned in the Middle Ages. I mean, the Saracens, the Muslims, were the enemies of Christendom throughout the Middle Ages. So, like, needless to say, they were the bad guys in many story and poem. And Muhammad comes in for much criticism as, the chief and originating figure of the bad guys. So there's nothing strange about finding him in Dante's hell, of course. But this is a little bit more unusual. As a schismatic, I mean, there are a bunch of places where Muhammad is depicted in Christian medieval poems as an idolater, which in an Islamic context is kind of ridiculous, right? And sort of emphasizes how little the poet seems to have known or cared about the actual tenets of Islam. But again, like that kind of thing, like it's to have, if Dante had put him among the blasphemers, I wouldn't have batted an eye, right? Had he put him among the heretics, would have seemed perfectly sensible. Even if he had put him in the like circle 7, like well, blasphemers are in circle 7 too, but in the violent against others, even that, right? Because remember, it was not only the like people who actually perpetrated acts of violence against the persons of other people, but also political, like invaders and usurpers were also there too. So I get, character, if Dante had chosen to characterize Muhammad primarily as some kind of like, bandit chieftain who committed violence against other people and nations, that wouldn't have shocked me. I'm not saying this absolutely shocks me, but it's a little surprising. I'm always a little bit surprised by this. Bruce, for exactly that reason, Bruce is asking, did they see Islam as a heresy of Christianity? Well, I mean, no, that's what I mean. Like that's not how they talked about it most of the time. Again, like it's more often to be put into the category of like pagan religions, essentially. And if anything, the kind like Old Testament language, right, about like Philistines and Canaanites and stuff gets borrowed in some Christian poems about the Crusades, or like Crusade era Charlemagne stuff. Even I'm thinking of things like the Song of Roland and stuff. So that's not. That's why I would have been less surprised to see him in almost any one of those other things. So yeah, Stephen, I wonder if this suggests that. So Stephen asked, does this suggest that Dante believed that Muhammad knew his teachings were false, right? That he was committing fraud, essentially. I don't think so. I don't think that that's what is happening here exactly. But hang on to that, Stephen, because I think it's a good kind of theory, right? Tony, you were thinking of a very similar thing, right? Yeah. And Stephen, you're right. I believe that Saladin ended up in limbo. Yeah. So it's not just a like categorical anti-Muslim thing going on here. Let's keep thinking about this. Let's get some more data and look at the bigger picture. Behind us here, a devil decks us out. This is the explanation for how they come to be dismembered. Behind us here, a devil decks us out so cruelly, replacing every one of this throng underneath the sword edge when we've made our way around the road of pain, because our wounds have closed again before we have returned to meet his blade once more. So they go in the circuit, they do a circuit of the pouch, and by the time they come all the way around the circumference, their horrible wounds have healed and they get cut open again. So it's the act of, it's not just the being severed, it's not just the being split open that is the punishment. It is the act of splitting that is the punishment, the continually repeated act of splitting. Okay. And yeah, Carrie, I agree. It's not just about fraud. Like, we can't be too distracted by fraud and thinking about, like telling lies and trying to con people. It is clearly the divisions that are what matter here, right? This is about divisions, I agree. But who are you who dawdle on this ridge, perhaps to slow your going to the verdict that was pronounced on your self-accusations? Death has not reached him yet, my master answered, nor is it guilt that summons him to torment, but that he may gain full experience. I, who am dead, must guide him here below, to circle after circle, throughout hell. This is as true as that I speak to you. Wait, what? This is as true as that I speak to you. the thing I just said is as true as the thing that I am just saying? Is it just me, or is that what that line means? This is as true. I must guide him. I who am dead must guide him here below to circle after circle throughout hell. This is as true as that I speak to you. What an odd thing to say. I mean, isn't that always true? I mean, anybody could say that anytime, couldn't they, right? That thing that I said is as true as the thing that I just said. As true as the fact that I am speaking to you. Aha, right. Kit and Sarah are explaining there. Okay, good. I was thinking, right, Bruce is, okay, thank you guys. I'm like, I must be misreading that. Okay, right. As true as that I speak to you, not as that which I speak to you. Right, okay, right. It is as true, like the thing that I said is as true as the fact that I am speaking. Right. Which is itself an interesting thing to say, because there we see the logical opposite of the distancing between words and speaker that we were seeing in the previous stanza, right? With Virgil, the speech and the act of speaking are the same. They're equally true, right? What I say is as true as the fact that I am speaking. There's this like different kind of identity of truth between the two of them. Yeah. Interesting. But anyway, okay. So we've got them, they're wondering about, so everybody, like all of the damned stop in their tracks and stare at Dante. Stare at him. Now he's gotten some attention before, but again, doesn't it sound like Virgil is having to explain this rather a lot here in the Malebolgia? Again, about, you know, Dante's body and the fact that he's still alive, and the you know, the tour that Virgil is leading him on. It is not guilt that summons him to torment. No. Dante is not a damned sinner finding his place. And you know what I can't help but wonder? Remember the number of times throughout the Malebolgia we've seen it with the snake people, we've seen it with the diviners, we've seen it bunches of places where Dante seems to identify, where Dante seems to connect himself, like the places where his own posture imitates their posture. There's been a bunch of sort of there, but for the grace of God go I, right? Or maybe this is where I'm going to be headed eventually, about the eighth circle for Dante. And it makes me wonder if that's part of what we're seeing going on here, right? That that all the people, so many times the people that see him, right, the damned souls that are seeing him are like, oh, are you coming to join? Oh, no, you're not. Okay, sorry, you just kind of looked like somebody who was coming to join us, right? Sorry, my mistake, right? That seems to be continuing to happen. And Devore, it is interesting that nobody, neither Virgil nor Dante, corrected the guy Guido in the fire who thought that Dante was dead, who assumed that Dante was dead, right, and could not possibly take his words back into the world. Yeah. Devore, which has the result of connecting the words to the person, right? What he did, the sin that he committed, doesn't he suggest that he kind of got away with it, right? Nobody knows that he had done it. And so that's why he's glad that nobody hearing him could possibly spill the beans back in the world, right? And yet Dante, of course, being alive and being the poet, is going to be able to make that connection. So he's going to close the gap, close the distance between the speaker and his words, right? And in that sense, undo like one of the layers of fraud, in a sense, right? Sorry, Dora, this is what you made me think of there. Yeah. Yeah, Stephen says, I got away with it is an odd thing to think when one is literally in hell. Agreed. I absolutely agree, which to me emphasizes the weirdness of all of this, like your legacy on Earth thing, as if your fame on Earth matters. Stephen, that's precisely what I would have said to this guy. Like, what difference does it make what anybody thinks of you, Mr. Condemned to Eternal Torment, right? What is your eternal torment going to be worse if people on Earth who are also themselves going to die, and perhaps some of them join you in torment, think well or ill of you? Like, who cares? But again, that's me. That's me, right? And that's me reading my Boethius and you know, holding on to my Boethius and saying that fame doesn't really matter. But I'm not sure that either Dante or Virgil necessarily agree with me on that point. Yeah, exactly, Serena. Dante does seem to be very concerned about reputation. Absolutely, as we see with all of this poetic one-upsmanship that's going on, right? But that reminds me to stick to the point here. Okay. More than 100, when they heard him, stopped within the ditch and turned to look at me, forgetful of their torture, wondering. Wow, he has brightened the day of just hundreds and hundreds of sinners there. Yeah. Tony is wondering if perhaps the fact that they're still so concerned about their earthly reputation is a sign of why they ended up in hell in the first place. It's possible, though, again, I would say that Virgil and Dante would seem to be in some kind of danger in that case. But again, maybe that's apt. Virgil does in fact live in hell. He lives in limbo, right? He lives in the nice neighborhood, but he still is living in hell. He is not saved. And Dante is not yet saved either. Again, he's still in the opening stages of his salvation journey. He still has a lot to learn as well, perhaps. Okay. Schismatics, division, focused. All right. Another sinner with his throat slit through and with his nose hacked off up to his eyebrows and no more than a single ear remaining had, with the others, stayed his steps in wonder. He was the first, before the rest, to open his windpipe on the outside, all blood red, and said, O you whom guilt does not condemn, and whom, unless too close resemblance cheats me, I've seen above upon Italian soil, remember Pierre da Medicina, I believe. If you ever see again the gentle plain that from Vercelli slopes to Marcabo. Okay. One of the things that's interesting here is the variety of the mutilations. Now, we shouldn't be shocked to see variety, as we've seen lots of variety, whether it be like the variety of the people interacting in various and disquieting ways with snakes, or whether you know, there were other kinds of varieties that we've seen. But what I'm looking at here is I'm again collecting data for the overall pattern, right? How do we understand the sin of this circle, which again seems simple on the surface, right? Being a schismatic, and of course I'm wanting still to loop that back to Muhammad, and also thinking about what this has to do with fraud, exactly, and how we understand that. This guy. So Muhammad was, well, unseamed from the chaps down past the nave, we were told, to twist a Shakespeare quote. But this guy's face is half slashed off. Is he talking through his windpipe? Is he actually speaking out of, because his throat is slit, right? and he opens his windpipe on the outside. I think he is. I think he's actually talking through the slit wound in his throat. Which would be challenging, right? Challenging to articulate that way. Talk about distance between the words and the tongue. We're just going to cut out the middleman entirely and doing words without the tongue. But okay. The idea, though, that his words are emerging from like this. So, I mean, his face is almost cut in half, right? He's cut through the face, and his one ear is removed, and he's slit across the throat. So his face is bisected, and his throat is cut, and it's through the wound that he's speaking. Remember the gesture of Muhammad. He wasn't only split open, he was pulling the wound apart with his hands. That is, both Muhammad and Pierre here are both of them utilizing, displaying, emphasizing. I'm tempted to say, though, it feels like a slightly irresponsible word, identifying with their rifts, their splits, their cuts, right? Okay, let's keep going. Virgil, for the first time, I think ever in the entire poem so far, tells him to move along, right? He's been instructing him to look again and again, right? Look over there. Make sure he's giving him a tour. He's supposed to see. Dante's job is to observe and to record what he sees, right? This is his job. This is the first time that Dante is rebuked, now gently rebuked, by Virgil for looking too much. Right, he's staring down, and Virgil's like, come on, let's move it along here, right? Stop looking so much. But I stayed there to watch that company and saw a thing that I should be afraid to tell with no more proof than my own self, except that I am reassured by conscience, that good companion, heartening a man beneath the breastplate of its purity. Not his purity, conscience's purity. So he has a pure conscience on this point, which is heartening him so that he can tell this thing that he knows that he saw, but like he can barely believe it himself. I surely saw, and it still seems I see, a trunk without a head that walked just like the others in that melancholy herd. It carried by the hair its severed head, which swayed within its hand just like a lantern. And that head looked at us and said, "Ah me." Out of itself it made itself a lamp, and they were two in one, and one in two. How that can be, he knows, who so decrees. This is the first guy that we see who is not just cut, but who is, well, I guess the other guy was missing his ear, and I suppose that counts, but this is a little bit more extreme, who's actually, we're talking about divisions, he's actually been divided into two pieces, right, such that he has to go around carrying his own head. I don't know what to make of it, but I think there has to be something here. If I were wanting to write a paper, what I would do is I would look at all of the examples of the times in the Inferno when Dante has either A, expressed his own incredulity about what he was about to explain, or B, professed concern about the probable or almost certain incredulity of his audience. And I would think about those in conjunction with the Geryon incident and the fraud business and the whole like fraud and my poem when he names his poem and the talk about allegory and the effigy of fraud, because that was one of the major examples of this, the Geryon description and scene. And I would think about and I would begin to think about what kind of patterns are there here, because this is something that, again, I feel like we're seeing more frequently here in the lower parts of hell. His repeated recourse to this kind of motif, that not only are you not likely to believe what he is describing, but he himself can barely believe what he is describing. And how does this fit in with things like fraud and allegory? And again, do we see in this a kind of anxiety in Dante, even a kind of connection? Again, this is where I come back to Geryon, right? Connection between fraud and his poem, right? That again, Dante feels himself in kind of perilous orbit of the circle of fraud here. And that some of that uncertainty or anxiety is manifesting itself in these protestations. Theorizing on the fly here, but that's certainly something I find interesting. Okay, more on Headless Lamp Dude. When it was just below the bridge, it lifted its arm together with its head so that its words might be more near us. Words that said, again with the proximity of words. And this time the words are distant from the body, but not the head. So whereas we had the disjunction, the throat is cut, the source of breath has been severed, and yet words still emerge. Right here, words are still emerging from the head, even when the head is entirely severed. Yeah. Now I'm all off on a whole like proximity of the words to the speaker kick here this evening. Anyway, sorry. Okay, where was it? Words that said, right. Now you can see atrocious punishment. You who still breathing, go to view the dead. See if there's any pain as great as this. And so that you may carry news of me, know that I am Bertrand de Born, the one who gave bad counsel to the fledgling king. I made the son and father enemies. Achitophel, with his malicious urgings, did not do worse with Absalom and David. Because I severed those so joined, I carry, alas, my brain dissevered from its source, which is within my trunk. And thus in me one sees the law of Contrapasso. That is where that word comes from. This is the one usage of that word in the Divine Comedy. One sees the law of Contrapasso, of counter penalty, as Mandelbaum translates it. Okay. First, before we think about Contrapasso, let's think about the sins of these folks. Muhammad, Pierre, and Bertrand de Born. Who is it? Am I remembering correctly? He was a troubadour also, wasn't he? Troubadour poet? I think he was. Anyway, sorry. Okay, so their sins, Muhammad, Pierre, Bertrand de Born. What does this show? What conclusions can we draw about schism, right? About schism and fraud? And don't forget, battles and literary depictions of battles, right? From the initial context. Okay. Bruce, he is? I thought so. I was pretty sure I was remembering correctly that Bertrand de Born was a troubadour. Okay. Okay, so sorry, folks on Twitch are still having issues with my audio. I have no idea. There is literally nothing different about my audio setup than ever. You might hear some background noise. I mean, I have my little heater on, as I usually do, because it's still freezing in the basement where I broadcast from. But yeah, I don't know. Interesting that it's not sounding weird to the others. Strange. Anyway, I apologize. That things are weird, and I will just hope that it ceases being weird somehow, as mysteriously as it began. Anyway, okay, so yeah, I don't think there's another live mic. Nope, definitely not. Sorry, I'm getting all distracted with tech supporting now, though. But let me just try one thing just to see if it makes a difference for you guys. How about that? That make a difference? Is that better? That change anything? Okay. We'll see. We'll see. Okay. So patterns. Bertrand de Born gave bad counsel to the fledgling king. I made the son and father enemies, and he compares himself to Achitophel in the story of Absalom and David. So with Absalom and David, and with the son and father being made enemies, giving bad counsel to the fledgling king, it is clear that it's not only schism. A heretic might be a schismatic in the sense that they're creating divisions within the church or something. But all of these seem to have in common fomenting civil wars, essentially. Muhammad being not only a religious, but also a military leader. And it's certainly true that Muhammad in his teachings, that one of the results was war, right? That came from that. And again, the interesting thing there is it suggests not the idea, if that's the trend, then it would not be that Muhammad is being condemned for separating from Christianity, or that Islam is being characterized as a schismatic sect of Christianity, but rather creating divisions within his people, right? Like that is fomenting the civil wars that he participated in for the rest of his life. In fact, it would suggest that Muhammad's religious stature and his religious teachings would be something like irrelevant to what got him here. And I wonder, it's strange. It's strange and curious. It would be weird to condemn Muhammad to the Christian hell with no reference to like religion at all, right? That would be unusual for sure. But it seems like, and again, I come back to the military context, right? We were introduced to this by being asked to remember the descriptions of all the mutilated corpses and all the, the literary accounts of all of the wars of the land of Italy, right? From Trojan, from the Trojan invasion up until modern times. And then we're introduced to the schismatics in this way. Bertrand de Born is the one who seems clearest to me. Let me go back for just a quick second to Pierre here. Yeah. No, he's not talking here about exactly what he did. But this seems to be the trend. David is wondering how clearly David would have understood the political situation of early Islam. Not very well, I wouldn't think. I can't imagine what kind of historical resources he would have available to him about, the sort of the political history of, Arabia at that time. So yeah, I can't imagine he knows very much, which is again another reason why it seems to me so odd to characterize Muhammad chiefly, like first and foremost, what he's going to go down in, history, Dante's history, because remember, this is the literary account describing corpses, which trumps all of the other literary accounts, which trump corpses, right? So again, by invoking, as I said, not only military scenes, but descriptions of military scenes, he is putting his poem in that context from the start. To include Muhammad there as his sort of defining sin, it's strange. So the schismatics, it's not a conceptual. These are not conceptual schisms that we're talking about. These are civil wars that we're talking about, chiefly. Being the people who brought about wars. And this, I think, is what brings us back to the fraud context, the big pattern of fraud that we have been seeing, at least most of the time, I think, in the Eighth Circle, and that is personal gain, right? Why did you lead civil war, right? What did your decision to foment a civil war say? What does it say about you? Well, what it says is you put your own cause, your own desires, your own motivations, your own politics above the integrity of the nation, right? It's more important. There is a sense in which they were sort of gaining by this, right? I made the son and father enemies, says Bertrand de Born. I severed those so joined. And so he carries his brain dissevered from its source, which is within my trunk. It is unnatural. That's what Dante emphasizes about the headless Bertrand, right? It is unnatural for a body to be walking around and holding its head. And I think Sir Gawain would agree with him on that point. That it's unnatural for that to happen. And it's that same kind of unnaturalness, which again, this is why the bodies are all mutilated, right? The bodies which are, the image of God, the fully intact and integrated body is, a sign of health and of, again, a connection to God himself and God's design. They are having their own body plans messed with, right? Because they messed with the body plan of the body politic. I think primarily the body politic. And this would seem to answer the question about why is Muhammad here and not with the heretics? Because it's not for heresy. It's not schisms within the faith, within any faith, that seem to be primarily of issue here. Now, back to that last word, contrappasso, which I've confessed to being annoyed by, or at least annoyed by the way that it tends to get applied. Well, here we have an explicit reference to the law of contrapasso. So, since Bertrand de Born gives himself as an illustration, explicitly as an illustration of the law of contrapasso, what is the law of contrapasso then? And what it is explicitly not, again, this is why I get annoyed, people talk about the law of contrapasso like it's a reversal, right? Like you've got the thing and then the thing is being like ironically reversed, like rebounding upon them and being reversed. That's not what we see, right? He is very much not saying like, because I divided things in life, now I'm being forced to weld things together, right? That would be a reversal, right, of what he did, but that's not what's happening, right? That which I did is being done to me. That thing that I participated in is being perpetuated, is being perpetuated, literally repeated again and again as it goes around the circle. It's being made literal in me, made visible and tangible in me. That seems to me what the law of Contrapasso means in this way. Yeah, Tony, like he's being forced to endure the wounds that the soldiers might have endured in the wars that they caused. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Okay, let's keep going. We can at least begin Canto 29. Get close to the end here. So many souls and such outlandish wounds had made my eyes inebriate. They longed to stay and weep. Oh, sorry, I had thought it was earlier that he was being rebuked. It's not, it's here at the beginning of the canto. I should have known that was a transitional moment. They longed to stay and weep. Now we're getting a distance between Dante and his eyes, right? His eyes are longing independently to stay and weep. Oh wait, so Dante's eye, what is Dante holding his eyes on a string now? Like Dante's eyes are separating from his body? Watch out, Dante, maintain your physical integrity. Anyway, his eyes are inebriate. They long to stay and weep. But Virgil said to me, why are you staring so insistently? Why does your vision linger there, below, among the lost and mutilated shadows? You did not do so at the other moats. If you would count them all, consider. 22 miles make up the circuit of the valley. The moon already is beneath our feet. The time allotted to us now is short, and there is more to see than you see here. Okay, so this is where Virgil moves him along. I love Virgil's response, and I think that the engineers in the crowd will appreciate this as well, right? Virgil's response to Dante is like, are you trying to count them all? Oh, just do the math, man. It's much easier, right? Look, the circumference of the circle is 22 miles. With that given piece of data, you can surely calculate for yourself how many souls there are in a jiffy, and then you won't have to stand there counting them all like an idiot, right? So let's do the math and let's move on. Seems to be Virgil's response. I find that really kind of funny. Funny, especially because Virgil doesn't seem to get it. I can't help but feel like Virgil is missing the point here, right? Dante is mesmerized by these guys, right? His eyes are drunk. His eyes have been inebriate. They long to stay and weep. So again, this sort of, and once more, I see this sort of implicit connection between Dante and the sinners below, right? We've gotten, you know, the guy with his guts hanging out, split down the middle with his guts hanging out. We've gotten the guy with his severed face and the talking slit throat, and we got the guy with the severed head, the talking severed head. Now we get Dante with his like detached eyes, right, floating around. Why? Why is Dante's physical integrity, at least metaphorically, at least poetically, being violated here? And my answer is, does this pouch also strike kind of close to home for Dante? Well, yeah. Dante take part in any civil wars? Kind of. Yeah. Did Dante foment any civil wars? Did he try? If you foment civil wars in your heart, it's just as bad as fomenting civil wars in, right? I mean, that would be kind of like an application of the Sermon on the Mount, I think. Did Dante, when he was exiled by his political opponents, want his allies and people to rise up and overthrow the evil people who had cast him out unjustly from Florence? Bet he did. Bet he did. Bet he thought about that. Bet there are times when Dante thought civil war would be better than to suffer these injustices, right? So that I may restore my position in society, so that I may recover my stolen goods so that I may restore my reputation, which of course I keep hearing that Dante's distant descendants are still to this day attempting to do here on the I forget what anniversary of things. Yeah, I just saw an article about this. One of Dante's descendants is suing in court to try to get them to repeal his banishment. Which I think is, that's great. That's excellent. Let's by all means keep the law courts occupied with things like that. But anyway, so yes, is Dante involved in some ways with that circle? Yeah, I think he is. But Virgil doesn't get it. Doesn't seem to get it at all. He's like, what are you counting them? They just calculated. It's fine. We got to hurry up. The moon's already beneath our feet, right? And here again, he's making reference to the time of day. It's getting late. We have an appointment. We have a schedule. We have an itinerary we have to keep to. Mount Purgatory awaits. Let's keep moving. Michael's thinking that 22 is a peculiar number. Does it mean something? Yeah. Of course it does. Is Dante going to throw out a number like 22 and not have it mean something? Do I know what it means? No idea. No, I have no idea what it means. But does it mean something? I'm sure it does. It almost has to. It almost has to. Yeah. Virgil's obliviousness to what's going on with Dante is interesting to me. And so we talked until we found the first point of the ridge that, if there were more light, would show the other valley to the bottom. When we had climbed above the final cloister of Malebolgia, so that its lay brothers were able to appear before our eyes, I felt the force of strange laments, like arrows whose shafts are barbed with pity. And at this, I had to place my hands across my ears. Just like the sufferings that all the sick of Val di Chiana's hospitals, Maremas, Sardinas, from July until September would muster if assembled in one ditch, so was it here, and such a stench rose up as usually comes from festering limbs. He is assaulted by the sound and by the smell from the last. It smells like gangrene, right? And it sounds like the suffering of all the sick. So just as in the last circle, we were gathering together all of the wounded and slaughtered on the battlefields of all of the literary depictions of all of the wars of Italy. So here we are gathering together all of the sick people from all of the hospitals of Italy and imagining the sound of all of their suffering combined together. Couple things here. One, the parallel interests me, the parallel between the last two of these, especially since we're both of them, as we're going to see, are having bodily integrity issues. But not only that, it's like he's taking turns with his. It was all about the eyes in the previous one, right? The sights that he saw, that he sees even now. Remember that, like the repeated emphasis of like what I saw. You know, I couldn't even believe it. You certainly won't believe it, but I barely accept. My conscience tells me that it's true. And him talking about what he saw and what he still sees now, like the vision of these things is still in front of him. And then of course we have his eyes, which are detached on their own there at the end. It was all about the eyes. Now it's all about the ears and the nose, such that he's now actually covering his ears, right? He places his hands across his ears to protect them from the sound. But the force of the strange laments. Here's the other thing that I'm interested in here. The force of the strange laments are like arrows whose shafts are barbed with pity. Barbed with pity. So the pity isn't what makes the arrow sink in. The pity is what makes them really painful to pull out, right? The laments are going in, right? He can't help it. But pity, which is why he's just trying to protect himself, right? And he covers his ears. Barbed with pity, I think, is such a powerful metaphor. And yes, I think, Tony, that I think these are lepers hospitals. Yeah. Gerald is wondering why July through September. Malaria season, Gerald says. Disease season, but also I've got to think that these places smell their worst between July and September. It's the smell he's describing there in that sentence. And I think that's when it's much, much worse. Yeah, exactly. That's what Jocelyn was saying. In the stink in the heat is worse. Yeah. Okay. Some lay upon their bellies, some upon the shoulders of another spirit. Some crawled on all fours along that squalid road. We journeyed step by step without a word, watching and listening to those sick souls who had not strength enough to lift themselves. I saw two sitting propped against each other, as pan is propped on pan to heat them up, and each, from head to foot, spotted with scabs. I have never seen a stable boy whose master waits for him, or one who stays awake reluctantly, so ply a horse with currycomb as they assailed themselves with clawing nails. Their itching had such force and fury, and there was no other help. Yeah, this is seriously gross. For my money, this is worse than the dismembered folks, but maybe that's just my personal tastes. The stable boy metaphor. Oh my goodness. I have never seen a stable boy. So we've got two stable boy circumstances. We've got one stable boy whose master is waiting for him, so he's rushing because he's being called for, and another stable boy who's rushing because he's lazy and he's reluctantly awake. He wants to go back to bed, or he wants to get to bed sooner, and so he's hurrying up and doing a sloppy job, but like hustling as fast as he can in brushing down the horses. So in either scenario, the stable boy is just brushing as fast and hard as he possibly can. That's a simile for how they scratched themselves with their clawing nails. Their itching had such force and fury as that, because of the scabs. I didn't see the scabs and the itching coming at first, right? At first, it sounds like they're invalids, right? Like they're incapacitated with illness. Some lay on their belly, some on the shoulders of another spirit. Some crawled on all fours. They don't have the strength to lift themselves. They're propped up against each other, right? That's what we're seeing in the background here behind me, by the way. But then we get the scabs and the itching. So the only thing activating them. So we see this general lassitude on the one hand, and this weakness, the weakness, the crawling, and then we get the itching, right? The itching and the scratching. And so their nails kept scraping off the scabs, just as a knife scrapes off the scales of carp or of another fish with scales more large. Okay, thank you for that simile. That's even worse. Oh, you who use your nails to strip yourself. Stop it, for crying out loud, the scabs. My guide began to say to one of them, and sometimes have to turn them into pincers. Seriously, tell us if there are some Italians among the sinners of this in this moat. So may your nails hold out eternal at their work. You're killing me with this, Virgil. We too, whom you see so disfigured here, we are Italians, said one in tears. But who are you who have inquired of us? My guide replied. From circle down to circle, together with this living man, I am one who descends. I mean to show him hell. Tony says, this is making me itch sympathetically. Me too. I've been like forcing myself not to scratch myself, Tony, for like the last 5 minutes here. Absolutely. Absolutely. Virgil seems unbothered by this. Okay, so my question, as usual, this is again another place we've not been told what their sins are yet. What is their sin? Now we're going to get told. It's going to be revealed eventually, whereas in some of these places it's not been revealed really at all explicitly. But we're going to get there. At least we're going to get something, and we'll see what we think about it. But once again, it's being delayed. Let me just point out things that seem to jump out at me here, and then we'll stop. The scabs, all this emphasis on the scabs and the scraping of the scabs. It's like currying a horse. It's like scaling a fish. We've got the pinchers and the claws. A scab. Well, first of all, like right after we've had the wounds, right we've got the bloody gaping wounds in the previous circle. We've got the scabs in this circle. And I can't help but think of a couple things. I can't help but think of hypocrisy, right? Like the scraping off of some of the surface of something, right? It's not exactly the same as hypocrisy, obviously. That was quite different, but again, that there's the fact that they're always scraping off a superficial layer of skin seems important and potentially relevant to fraud. That's what I'm saying. The other thing that I can't help but think of, and I can't believe nobody has mentioned this yet. Thank you, Bruce. There it came in. I knew someone was going to finally talk about this. Eustace scraping off his dragonish skin in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Yes, absolutely. That's just exactly what I was thinking of. I was also, of course, thinking of Naaman the leper from 2nd Kings. Isn't it 2nd Kings? He was an Elisha dude, wasn't he? That was an Elisha thing. Anyway, yeah. The idea of the contrast between cleaning, I mean, all the leprosy talk in the Bible, right? About the uncleanness, the superficial uncleanness, right, of the skin, and the cleansing, right? We've got the cleansing of leprosy used as a repeated image in the New Testament, the miraculous washing of Naaman the Moabite. Is he Moabite? He's from somewhere anyway. He's a Gentile. In the River Jordan, right? His 7 baths in the River Jordan and the cleansing of his skin. 2 Kings 5, nailed it. Yeah, anyway, so that certainly seems another relevant thing, that connection to cleanness and uncleanness, and their scraping off of their scabs, like the scaling of a fish, right, is like, not only, it's not just the fact that they're itchy, but like they're trying to cleanse themselves, but they can't cleanse themselves. All they can do is make their sores worse and worse. as they continue to scratch. So it's like a repetition of that sort of cleansing process. Again, like Eustace and the dragon skin, but of no avail. Also kind of like Eustace and the dragon skin at first, but let me get away from that. Okay. With that, with this pleasant visual image, I will leave you for the evening. I will be back next week to finish up the Malebolgia and descend into the 9th circle of hell. Very exciting. Fraudulent against people that against non-strangers. Malicious fraud against non-strangers, going to be exciting. So yes, pleasant dreams, everybody. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye now.